You know how people say they're so done after getting a paper cut or waiting in line for more than 6 minutes? Well, imagine waking up in a one-room cottage that smells faintly of boiled cabbage, goat and despair, and finding out that half your neighbours are leaking from their armpits in a way that strongly suggests today will not be your day. Welcome to the 14th century. The coffee hasn't been invented yet. The word hygiene is still just a twinkle in the eye of future regret. And whatever that thing is on your leg, yeah, that's probably going to end your week. Tonight, we're gently wandering into what it was actually like to live through one of the worst health decisions ever made by a species that still thought bathing might kill you. This is Sleepy Historian, and we're setting our pestilence-splattered feet into the very cosy, faintly infected world of the plague. Now, when people hear the plague, they usually imagine a man in a bird mask, looking like he just wandered out of a very enthusiastic Renaissance fair. But we're not there yet. No, first we're waking up on a straw mattress with something squishy underneath that wasn't squishy yesterday. You blink your eyes open, you stretch, you hear the neighbour coughing in Latin, and somewhere in the distance someone is screaming, softly, because their lungs have given up. You're probably already uncomfortable, which means we're on the right track. Let's say you're a peasant. Statistically, you probably are. You've got one shirt, no shoes, and an understanding that the church, the stars, and possibly the cat are all watching your every move. You rise with the sun because it's shining in your face, not because you're motivated, and you go outside to dump the contents of the family bucket into the street. That's the morning routine. No yoga, just bucket. Your village isn't big. Maybe a few dozen homes, some pigs, one local wise woman who may or may not be a witch depending on how the crops are doing. And then one day, just like that, old Thomas, who sells questionable meat on the corner, starts turning purple. And not in a fun way, more like in a let's all say goodbye from a distance and pretend it's allergies kind of way. From there, things sort of continue, because back then, you didn't stop everything just because someone was dying. People died all the time. It was practically a hobby. You just kept going, feeding your chickens, weaving your turnip baskets, avoiding the rats who, it turns out, had some truly terrible news to deliver. See, nobody knows what's going on. One theory is that God is upset. Another theory is that the stars are having a bad month. Yet another theory involves miasma, which is a fancy way of saying air but scary. So naturally, everyone starts burning herbs, blaming each other, and walking around with posies shoved in their faces like nature's worst air freshener. It doesn't help, but it smells like effort, and that's what counts. Now you might think, surely someone tried to fix it, and they did, by bleeding people. Because when someone's already weak and hallucinating, what you really want to do is remove more blood. You know, just in case that was the problem. Meanwhile, over in the city, things are worse. There's more of everything. More people, more rats, more shouting, more carts labelled, "Bring out your dead," which, in hindsight, really lacked subtlety. And if you were rich, congratulations. You still might die, but at least you'll do it while surrounded by curtains. Monks are writing about it, doctors are drawing pictures, nobody is washing their hands. And if you were hoping for a medical breakthrough, it won't come for another several centuries, and even then it involves antibiotics and a microscope, both of which have yet to be invented, but we'll get to all of that. For now, just lie back. Picture the gently crumbling stone of your medieval cottage, the flickering light of your tallow candle, the faint, reassuring sound of rats gnawing softly in the rafters. And know that you are, in this moment, blissfully lice-ridden, misunderstood, and probably contagious. You're in good company, and probably covered in goose grease. We'll explain later. The year is vaguely medieval. Let's call it the 1340s, though your village probably doesn't own a calendar, or a clock, or anything with gears, really. Time is mostly measured by how often the cows are mooing, and whether or not the priest looks panicked. It's morning, technically, although the sun's arrival is less bursting forth and more reluctantly filtering through several layers of soot, fog, and divine disappointment. The air smells like yesterday's firewood, last month's laundry, and something mysterious fermenting in a bucket behind the apothecary. You were going to ask what it was. Then you remembered how the last villager who asked questions ended up exorcised. Coal smoke drifts lazily from chimneys, at least the chimneys that haven't collapsed under the weight of pigeons, moss, or casual architectural neglect. It lingers in the thatched rooftops and sticks to your woolen cloak like it's auditioning for a permanent role, which, frankly, it is. The streets are paved with mud, straw, and regret. Carts creak by, their wooden wheels groaning like arthritic knees, pulled by equally creaky oxen that look like they've been reincarnated too many times and are starting to suspect a prank. Somewhere nearby, a rooster crows with the vocal enthusiasm of a sleep-deprived substitute teacher. You think about breakfast, but remember, it's probably going to be bread, with a side of bread lightly seasoned with mould. And if you're really lucky, perhaps a smear of despair. Your mattress is, by all technical definitions, a collection of straw held together by wishful thinking and the body heat of every flea in the district. It rustles faintly as you shift, either from the straw settling or the flea council holding a morning meeting about biting strategy. Outside, distant church bells toll with that familiar, comforting, someone definitely died again rhythm. They echo across the fields, through the fog, and into the hearts of peasants who haven't had a reason to smile since the last mummer's play accidentally set fire to the bakery. In the corner of your room, if one can call 4 damp walls and a curtain a room, your shoes sit, crusted with mud, and something else you're pretending is also mud. Your cloak hangs from a wooden peg, proudly exuding the musk of a medieval winter, part smoke, part sheep, part despair. Children shriek joyfully in the distance, their games involving hoops, sticks, and elaborate chants about warding off evil spirits using a cabbage. You briefly wonder how they have the energy, then you remember they haven't been taxed yet, or married, or accused of witchcraft for sneezing in public. A goat ambles by outside your window. You don't own a goat. No one owns this goat. The goat is free. You envy the goat, and in the air, a quiet hum. Not a hum of life exactly, more of a persistent background tinnitus that comes from a town where everything's slightly damp, slightly broken, and slightly contagious. The kind of place where people know each other by name, but also by smell. A cart rumbles past, its driver coughing into his sleeve in a way that feels more narrative than medical. The kind of cough that says, "I'm not long for this world, but I'm still going to deliver this bag of onions, because that's just who I am." The morning mist hangs like a badly folded bedsheet over the town square, softening the shapes of the gallows, the well, and Mrs. Bramble's inexplicably angry goose. Everything is quiet, slow, and ever so slightly alarming. You lie back, gaze upward at your timbered ceiling, and listen to the soothing drip of condensation hitting the chamber pot. Because even in medieval times, mornings come with plumbing issues. And so begins another quiet, grimly poetic day in the shadow of the plague, where every breath is a little gamble, every handshake a potential curse. And yet, somehow life goes on. Sort of. Now that you're awake, or at least halfway between wakefulness and existential drifting, it's time to begin your medieval to-do list. Survive, preferably until lunch. Ideally without developing any suspicious swellings. But before we get to all that, before you even think about getting up or rolling over or contemplating the state of your mattress, go ahead and click that little subscribe button. It's right there, practically medieval in its commitment to consistency. Give it a gentle tap if you enjoy this kind of charming historical gloom. Maybe click like too if you want the algorithm to know you enjoy soft horror disguised as bedtime stories. And feel free to leave a comment telling us where and when you're watching, because nothing says peaceful plague nap quite like knowing someone in Toronto is watching this from a blanket fort at 2 a.m. while eating cold noodles. Alright, you're comfy, the goat's gone, the fleas have settled in. Let's begin. You walk slowly, bucket in hand, cloak dragging. The cat ahead of you flicks its tail like it's the mayor of this village, and you're late for something you didn't agree to attend. You pass that same fence post with the missing plank. No one fixes anything anymore, except beliefs. those get patched daily. And somewhere between your left foot and your right, you remember it's 1348. You live in a time when birthdays are theoretical, medicine is gossip, and Europe is about to be, well, less full by a lot. Nearly half the continent, give or take, won't see the next decade. The future, it's thinning out like soup on a poor Sunday. People say it's bad air, or judgment, or mice with tiny grudges. But mostly, they just say, have you heard? No one says what they've done. The doctors, if you can call them that, have started dressing like rejected birdhouses. Long-beaked masks, black robes, heavy gloves. They say the beaks are stuffed with rosemary, camphor, lavender, and sometimes bits of citrus or crushed violets. Anything that smells like it wants to be far away from here. It's supposed to protect them from miasma. That's the word now. Bad air, unholy breeze, invisible punishment you inhale by accident. One doctor said his mask worked. Then he coughed into it. Then he was gone. You pass by a house with a small X drawn in ash above the door. No one mentions it, but everyone sees it. You walk faster. They say plague victims develop lumps, swellings, underarms, groin, neck, big angry things. They turn black. They weep. People say the pain drives you mad before the fever finishes the job. Then there's the bleeding, from places that should not bleed. And finally, a stillness, the kind that creeps up the limbs, like dusk climbing your bones. Some say it's a curse. Others say it's the stars. The alignment's wrong. Too much Mars. Not enough mercy. The village scribe tried to keep track, made a list, wrote names. Then he ran out of parchment. Then he ran out of ink. Then he ran out of himself. The list stopped with Agnes the Tall. Nobody talks about Agnes the Short. You stop in the middle of the path. The wind picks up. It smells like damp wood, smoke, and distant apples. You like that part. The apples. You think about the musks again. Imagine a man standing over you in a black cloak, head-shaped like a stork's nightmare, holding tongs and muttering about leeches and warm compresses. Somehow, that's still preferable to letting Jorin try his garlic experiment on you. You resume walking. The cat has turned around, as if to ask, "Did you forget how legs work?" You nod, mostly to yourself. You think about the numbers again. 50%, half of everything, half of everyone. You wonder what it feels like to be a survivor. Then you realize, if you're wondering that, you're still in the running. At least for now. You pass the smithy. He's closed. The hammer's still. Anvil cold. He lost 2 sons in the last fortnight. Now he just sits outside, sharpening tools he never sells. You tip your head to him. He doesn't look up. At the chapel, someone has left a bowl of herbs, a peace offering, to whom no one is sure. Probably the wind. And now, back at your door, something new, a charm. It hangs from the lintel, bones, string, a feather. You don't touch it, you don't ask. You step inside. The room is quiet, softer, less world, more blanket. You set the bucket down. It exhales. Or maybe you do. And as you sit by the fire, small, tired, trying, you whisper something old. Still here. Not for anyone to hear. Just the room. Just yourself. Just history. Tired and ridiculous. Unrolling softly around your shoulders like a second cloak. Now let's imagine this. It's 1348. You live in a city. Congratulations. Your rent is a pile of rats. Your air is a blend of chimney soot and boiled onions. And your neighbours are 3 families. 1 goat and a man who insists he's descended from Caesar, even though he cannot spell Caesar. You hear the word plague whispered in the marketplace. Not shouted, of course. That would be uncouth. Just slipped into conversation the way people today mention gluten intolerance or pyramid schemes. Casually, but also with a distinct twitch in the eye. And then people start leaving, quietly at first. A merchant shuts his stall early. A noble's carriage rolls out at midnight. Then your friend Beatrix vanishes. No goodbye. Just gone. You check her house. The fire's cold. Her bread's still on the table, and someone took all the spoons. All of them. Even the bent one. This is what passes for a sign these days. Soon, others follow. Tailors, bakers, philosophers. Or, as they were known back then, guys who talk too much with no farm skills. People pack bags, or sacks, or just tie things in bits of cloth and start walking. Because when disease strikes, humans revert to instinct, and that instinct is run until the trees outnumber the people. No plan, no maps. Just an overwhelming belief that the countryside is somehow less plaguey. It's the same logic that makes people think natural spring water can't carry bacteria. It's wet, it's in nature, it must be safe. They leave the cities in waves, coughing waves, stumbling waves. One guy left with a donkey, a lute, and 3 cabbages. No one asked what the plan was. No one wanted to know. This is how you end up with entire roads filled with people who used to be barbers or glove makers or experts in eel pies trying to pretend they can forage. Spoiler, they cannot forage. Most of them can't identify time, let alone cook with it. One man boiled grass for dinner, died of sadness, and of course fleeing the city doesn't stop the plague. It simply relocates it, rebrands it, a sort of travelling show, but with more weeping and less ticketing. The towns they flee to, completely unprepared, no infrastructure, no wall. One guy with a bucket who declares himself the sanitation minister. Good luck, Bucket Man. Now suddenly your sleepy farming hamlet has 30 new residents. They smell like horse. They brought stories and rumours, and in one case an aunt named Trudy who definitely isn't sick and just coughs when she's near hay. Trudy, you're fooling no one. Naturally, panic ensues. The villagers, up until now, were living in blissful denial. Yes, they'd heard of the sickness. But they were busy with more pressing concerns, like whose turn it was to patch the roof and whether goats can be cursed if they look smug. And now here you are, surrounded, a cosmopolitan plague soup. People begin to lock themselves inside. Boards go up, doors get barred. One man builds a moat around his cottage. It's just a ditch, really, filled with questionable stew water. But he stands by it with a stick and says it's protection. He also named the stick Justice. Some try the herbal root, sage bundles, lavender satchels. One woman ties garlic around her ankles and declares immunity. She also begins every conversation with, "I read this in a dream," so you take it with salt. And not the good kind, the panic kind. A travelling friar shows up and gives a sermon about repentance. Something about sin and dancing and the colour red being suspicious. He sells talismans. They're just rocks with faces drawn on them. 2 goats buy 1. The townspeople argue about how to proceed. There's a meeting. It lasts 9 minutes. Someone suggests prayer. Someone else suggests isolation. Someone else suggests throwing the newcomers in a barn and seeing what happens. The final decision, everyone goes home and pretends they're making a plan. It rains for 3 days. The newcomers are wet. The villagers are paranoid. The rats are thriving. By now, the sickness has a routine. It starts quiet. A cough, a bit of fatigue, the "I'm just tired from walking" excuse. Then the lumps, the colour changes, the silence. Someone begins ringing the chapel bell every morning. No one asks who. They just listen. It rings once, then twice, then 3 times. No pattern, no reason, but it rings. And what's most fascinating is that the countryside, supposedly safe, clean, full of fresh air and holistic vegetables, starts to feel just like the city, but slower, somehow wetter, with more chickens. You realise the problem was never just the city, it was people moving around, touching things, having conversations, refusing to sit still, inventing conspiracy theories about cats or soup or the phases of the moon. People are amazing at many things. Quarantine is not one of them. So now, instead of a tidy death in one place, you have a distributed experience, like a medieval pop-up shop, one village at a time. And yet, somehow people still hope. They still light candles, still pass down tips, still hang herbs above doors, still whisper about the one guy who recovered, that rare mythical creature. Still believe that maybe if they get far enough into the woods, the sickness will get bored and go back to the city. It doesn't. It follows, patiently, politely, like a guest no one invited who insists on staying until the party ends and your house burns down. And in the end, the city empties. The villages shrink. The roads get quieter, not because people got smarter, but because they ran out. And the countryside, once imagined as a refuge, becomes just another chapter, a softer, greener battlefield, a place where people still try to outrun the air. If you're living through the Black Death and you don't understand how it works, and let's be honest, no one does, you're going to try things, random things, hopeful things, loud, messy, mysterious, suspicious things. It starts with logic, then drifts into creativity. Then it cannonballs into total chaos, and the villagers call it healing. Let's go down that list. 1. Burying shoes at crossroads. For reasons lost to both time and footwear experts, people began digging shallow holes at crossroads and placing shoes, usually worn, sometimes still warm, as offerings to no one in particular. It wasn't about gods or saints, just a gut feeling that somebody out there respected second-hand leather. Did it work? Number. Did the shoes mysteriously go missing? Yes. Local dogs had mixed reviews. 2. Drawing circles around entire homes. People figured if drawing a circle around a person kept demons out, why not scale it up? You'd see families chalking, peeing, or prayer chanting giant rings around their houses. Some used crushed snail shells, others preferred ritually stepped hay. A few just dragged their chickens in a circle and called it spiritual geometry. Plague still got in. It didn't care about your medieval crop circle. 3. Eating clay, specifically holy clay, collected from under church floors, graveyard corners, or that hill where someone saw a dove sneeze 3 times in a row. Definitely a sign. It was ground up, mixed with old ale, and consumed in small lumps by anyone with a cough and a lack of self-preservation. Reported side effects included diarrhea, divine visions, and regret. 4. Bathing in barrel-aged fermented cabbage water. Some healers believed sourness drove out sickness, so they left cabbage in barrels for weeks, sometimes months, in summer, outside, under the judgment of God and every insect in Europe. Then you'd be told to bathe in it, soak in it, let the medicinal fermentation draw the disease out through your knees. No one felt better. Everyone smelled like betrayal and soup. 5. Counting backward from 100 while holding an egg. This practice comes from a town so remote even the rats didn't visit. A folk remedy passed down from someone's half-drunk uncle. The ritual involved sitting very still, holding a raw egg in your left hand, and counting backward from 100 to 1, while thinking about all the people you hadn't offended that week. The egg would either absorb the illness or explode from spiritual tension, depending on who was telling the story. No one knows what happened if you dropped it on 37, but people said you didn't want to find out. 6. Swallowing small pebbles. Blessed by a beekeeper. You weren't allowed to use just any beekeeper. It had to be one with a limp, a widow's cowl, and at least 2 missing teeth. They'd whisper into a pouch of pebbles, bless it with honey breath, and hand it off in exchange for 3 coins and half a boiled onion. The idea was that carrying the bee-blessed pebbles in your stomach grounded your inner winds, a term no one could explain, even then. 7. Drinking the first morning dew off a plague-free virgin's front door. You had to get up before dawn, creep across town, find the house of a young woman who probably hadn't gotten sick yet, then crouch and lick the dew off her door. Yes, that happened. No, it wasn't subtle. There were brawls over access to particularly fresh doors. Eventually, people started faking dew with ladles of river water. Society held together only by shame and mouldy ethics. 8. tying bread to your knees and screaming into a jug. This was a spiritual purge technique. You'd attach a piece of stale bread to each knee, symbolic perhaps of humility or just poor aim. Then kneel, scream all your fears into a jug, and bury the jug. Sometimes they lit the jug on fire. Sometimes they kissed it goodbye. Sometimes they used it to serve porridge the next day. No two healers agreed on the meaning, but it looked impressive, and that's what mattered. 9. Carrying a mouse skeleton in your pocket for balance. Just the bones. Clean, white, and wired together with sheep gut. Tucked into your pocket for spiritual symmetry. The belief was that plague couldn't strike someone already haunted. And what's more haunted than dead rodent jewellery? People compared mouse skeleton sizes. It became a status symbol. Eventually, nobles started wearing them on hats. Yes, hats. 10. Writing a letter to the plague. Some people decided to just cut out the middleman. They wrote letters directly to the plague, not to the king, not to God, to the concept of plague itself. These letters varied from polite negotiation, "Please kindly skip our family this season," to veiled threats, "We have a moat and unsharpened spears." They'd then fold the letter, stick it under a rock, or nail it to a tree near the village well. The plague never responded, but one man swore his goat got healthier after he burned his letter, so science. So no, these things did not help, not even a little. But they filled time. They gave people something to do with their hands, because standing still, doing nothing, waiting to die quietly, was just too much. And so they boiled cabbage, buried shoes, screamed at furniture, and made offerings to invisible forces with no postal address. Because when you're out of hope, out of answers, and out of garlic finally, you invent something new, even if it's just kneeling on bread. Eventually someone dies. Again, and again, and again. It's not shocking anymore, it's just on schedule. There's no official time of death, no dramatic final words, no dramatic music. The body just stops doing things, stops breathing, stops blinking, stops looking like a person, and starts looking like a task. What happens next isn't handled with solemn music or flowing robes. It's handled with a shovel, a cart, and someone muttering that this one's heavier than expected. There is no embalming. There are no professional undertakers. The job of body management goes to whoever has the fewest excuses and the strongest stomach. Sometimes it's the village miller. Sometimes it's a guy named Percival who used to sweep the chapel steps but got promoted by attrition. Sometimes it's nobody, and the body just sits for a while. Flies arrive, cats circle, someone lights incense, not out of reverence, but out of necessity. Eventually, the body is wrapped, not in silk, not in linen, just whatever cloth is around. Sometimes a curtain, sometimes a borrowed cloak, occasionally a flour sack with the logo still printed on it. Shoes are optional, so is dignity. There are no death certificates, just quiet consensus. He's gone. She passed in the night, wasn't breathing this morning. Then someone nods, then someone else nods, and then it becomes a fact. The burial itself. If the body is lucky, it gets a proper grave, a shallow one, dug quickly, possibly with a spoon, depending on how bad things have gotten. There's no procession, no organ music, just 2 or 3 people standing at a safe distance, pretending this is ceremonial and not the 5th burial today. Someone might say something, a prayer, a chant, a vague compliment. He liked onions. She made a good broth, never stole from the fish stall, even when it was tempting. The body is lowered, not with ropes but with creative gravity. There's no headstone, just a rock, or a stick, or in some cases, a boot, if the boot survived longer than its owner. Graves aren't always marked. Sometimes people forget where they buried someone. Sometimes they don't want to remember. And sometimes the ground is too full and the next burial is creatively adjacent. Layered, let's say. Stacked like poorly managed firewood. Quiet, but inefficient. Grief, if you can call it that. Crying happens, sometimes, but not often. It takes energy, and nobody has any of that left. Grief becomes a private performance, a single sigh, a slightly longer pause before picking up a bucket, a refusal to eat the good turnip. Nobody makes speeches, nobody makes scrapbooks. They just survive. One person lighter. People stop asking, "How are you?" They start asking, "Who's next?" And you never answer. You just look around. Grief is expressed in strange ways. A loaf of bread left outside a neighbour's door, a whistle you hum that used to be someone's favourite, a pile of stones that wasn't there yesterday. Sometimes people draw, not pretty drawings, just scratches in wood, 3 lines, 1 circle, a symbol that only meant something to 2 people. Now it's just a mark. What happens if there's no time? Then there's no burial. Bodies stay in beds, or corners, or carts. Sometimes they're moved to the holding field, which is a term the villagers made up to feel better about the meadow full of death. People say things like, "We'll bury them properly when this is over." Nobody believes it. Not even the person who said it. Some people burn the bodies. Not because they understand sanitation, but because they understand smell. Others just board up the room. Nail the door shut, paint a mark outside, step back and call it respect. You might walk by a house and think, is anyone still in there? You'll never ask. You'll never find out. You'll just walk faster. The fear of touching the dead. Touch is complicated now. You want to hold their hand, kiss the forehead, whisper something like, "Thank you," or "I'm sorry," or "You always cooked the cabbage too long, but I ate it anyway." But you don't, because touch is risk, and risk is deadly. So instead, you use a stick. You poke the cloth. You wait for a sign. Then you nod and move on. Children are told not to look, which of course means they look more. Some try to bring flowers, which is sweet and utterly ineffective. Still, a dandelion under a corpse's hand somehow feels right, wrong, but right. Animals get confused. Dogs wait at doors that don't open anymore. Cats curl around ankles that no longer move. Goats enter homes like detectives, sniffing at the air, wondering where the voice went. No one explains it to them, because no one can explain it to themselves. There's no closure, just absence, and the sound of wind through a window that no one remembers opening. The body becomes a rumour. After a few days, the person isn't even a memory. They're a sentence, a story, a remember when, and after a few more days, even that fades. There's no room for legacy, just logistics. No one writes anything down. Paper is expensive, and besides, who would read it? Eventually someone new moves into the house, reuses the blanket, wears the shoes, finds a locket and wonders who this was. Then they tuck it into a drawer and say nothing. And yet, somehow, the world continues. The sun rises, the bell rings, someone bakes bread, someone sings off-key while cleaning a pan with ashes and old ragweed. Someone else dies, and someone else lives, not because they're stronger, not because they're luckier, but because their body just hasn't stopped yet. You'd think this cycle would harden people, turn them into husks, but strangely, it doesn't. People still laugh, still feed chickens, still argue about whether it's too early to plant beans, still whisper thank yous to clouds, rocks and saints they haven't named yet, because that's what happens after the body is gone. The village breathes, wobbly, awkward, but still breathing. And that's the story, not of one body, but of what's left behind when everyone's too tired to cry, but somehow still shows up to do it all again tomorrow. Eventually, the coughing slows. Not everywhere, not all at once, not with fanfare or finality, just less. A few days pass, then a few more. No bell, no new grave, no new rumour, just empty air and people squinting at it like it's suspicious. You think, maybe it's over. You don't say it out loud. That would be tempting fate, and fate is cranky and easily provoked. But the air feels different, less crowded. Even the flies seem confused, like they arrived at a feast and everyone left before dessert. And what happens now? You'd think there'd be a celebration, a festival, a grand speech. Instead, the aftermath arrives the way a puddle dries up, quietly, without applause, leaving a crust where something used to be. No parades, just fewer bodies, fewer people, and a lot more room on the bench outside the chapel. The superstitions begin immediately because nature hates a vacuum and humans hate unassigned meaning. So we start inventing. The birds flew in a straight line this morning. That means peace. The moss has changed sides on the tree trunk. That means the spirits are moving on. I found a coin facing up in the dirt. That means the plague is now in the next town over. Truth doesn't matter, only rhythm. People need something to nod at, something to blame, something to bless. New rules of the universe, according to your village. If a baby laughs in its sleep, it has the gift of protection, unless it laughs 3 times, then it's haunted. If you dream of water, someone you love will be spared, unless the water is muddy, then they'll stub a toe, which is clearly an omen. If the fire burns blue for no reason, someone's lying. About what? Unclear, but someone's lying. If your bread rises too fast, it means a restless soul has passed through your oven. Eat it anyway. Just don't butter it before dusk. Never say, quiet week. Just don't. You'll get blamed for whatever happens next. Objects. With new importance. That spoon you've used for 3 winters. It's now lucky. Don't wash it too thoroughly or it'll forget you. The pebble in your shoe? Leave it there. It guided you through the sickness. It knows things. Your neighbour's dog? Possibly divine. He barked at a travelling peddler who left without sneezing. You saw it. You believe. Even colours get rewritten. Red is power now. Blue is protection. Yellow means someone in this house survived. Green is either luck or decay. Depends on who you ask and how recently they've eaten. Sacred gestures that no one questions, tapping 3 times on the door before entering, circling your thumb over a bruise while whispering a line from a song you forgot the name of, spitting over your left shoulder before biting into an apple, a ritual invented by a farmer who lived and now has a cult following. Someone starts tying feathers to fence posts, someone else wears a cloak backward on Fridays to confuse the lingering spirits. One woman walks her goat counterclockwise every morning around her cottage. She says it resets the air. You believe her because she's still alive, and that's proof enough. Rewriting history before it's even cold. People start saying things like, remember when we all survived by eating boiled bark? No, we didn't. That was Gerald. Gerald chipped a tooth and cried for 2 days. I always knew if we lit the fire with rosemary, we'd be safe. You didn't. You only started doing that after your roof fell in and you thought it smelled nice. Our town was smarter than the rest. It wasn't. You just happened to be far enough from the main road that the disease got bored. But it doesn't matter. History isn't written by the winners, it's written by the survivors. And surviving makes you an expert in everything. Ghosts become normal. There are more of them now, not the scary kind. Just the remembered kind. You see them in routines, the way the baker's door creaks and no one's there, the sound of a laugh you could swear belonged to a woman who hasn't been seen since harvest, a scarf left hanging in the chapel, a name scratched into the underside of a stool, the smell of someone's soup that no one can quite replicate. Some people talk to them, others avoid looking at their chairs. A few start leaving pieces of bread on windowsills, just in case. No one says ghosts. That would be dramatic. They say echoes. They say the weight of memory. They say don't sit in that seat unless you want to be visited. Births start to matter. Again, When a baby is born, it's a miracle, even if it's loud, weird-looking, and poops every 11 minutes. It's alive. That's the only qualification for reverence now. They get weird names. Names like Hopewell and Second Chance. One family names their baby Savivia. Another goes with Banana, because apparently near-death experiences destroy judgment. But no one complains. Because crying babies mean breathing families. The first time a toddler sneezes in public, 12 people flinch. But when nothing happens, someone buys a cabbage to celebrate. What the future looks like now. A lot like the past, but hazier, slower, softer. People still bake, still plant, still sing off-key, but they look over their shoulders more. They sit closer when they eat. They talk to the sky like it's listening now. You build back what fell, repair what can be repaired, ignore what can't. You tell stories, some true, some exaggerated, all necessary. You light candles not just for prayer, but to say, we're still here. You open windows to prove the air is yours again. You walk barefoot in the grass, not because it's wise, but because you can. And maybe you still whisper a charm when the wind shifts, just in case, because the plague is gone. But the superstition, that's just getting started. By now, your cough has taken on an artistic quality, rhythmic, hollow, interpretive. The priest has been summoned, though he's also been summoned 6 times already this week and is currently napping in the chapel behind a barrel of communion wine. You are dying, or possibly not. It's hard to say. Medicine hasn't exactly cleared that up. Death, in this period, wasn't so much an event as a prolonged social inconvenience, a sort of awkward house guest that stayed just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable but not long enough to be interesting. And so, you wait, on a lumpy mattress that seems designed by someone who hated backs. With linens that were once white, though the passage of time and lack of soap have turned them a sort of nostalgic beige. The room smells faintly of onions, beeswax and anxiety. A neighbour pops in to loudly whisper that they're praying for you, as if volume is proportional to piety. Another leaves you a hardened loaf of bread, which is either a thoughtful gift or a passive-aggressive gesture meant to speed things along. Spiritual preparation is key. The goal, according to the church, is to cleanse your soul of sin before you make your grand exit. It's like checking out of a particularly judgmental hotel. This often involves confession, last rites, and, if you're lucky, the application of holy water that's been blessed and possibly strained through a linen cloth. The priest, when he arrives, recites Latin with the enthusiasm of a man who hasn't slept since Wednesday. His breath carries notes of fasting and mild resentment. You confess to every sin you can remember, including that time you borrowed a neighbour's spoon and didn't return it. He nods solemnly. You mention you once felt envy over someone else's boots. He looks concerned. You reveal that you sometimes dream of bacon. He tells you that's fine, provided it's metaphorical. Meanwhile, hygiene, always a negotiable concept, is suddenly elevated to ceremonial status. If your family is well off, they may sponge your face with rose water. If not, they might settle for gently shaking out your blanket and declaring you freshened. Someone offers to trim your nails, though they get distracted halfway through and wander off, leaving you asymmetrical for eternity. The candles are lit, mostly because it's dark, but also because it gives the illusion of sanctity. Their dim flicker casts your features in a warm glow, which is far more flattering than your current physical reality deserves. Your hair is brushed with all the reverence of preparing a ceremonial lamb, though less evenly. And then there's the matter of your funeral preparations. It's customary to select your shroud, though choices are limited. Most people opt for linen, simple, breathable, and coincidentally already owned by someone else who didn't make it. The grave has possibly been dug in advance, or at least strongly considered. It's not uncommon for someone to mention your favourite hymn, only to realise no one knows the words or the melody. Someone suggests humming. There's also the will, which you dictate to a scribe who misspells your name and leaves halfway through because his cousin is coughing in the next village. You intend to leave your shoes to your niece, your comb to your cousin, and your goat to whichever neighbour feeds her next. The goat is in the room, chewing paper. She seems unfazed by your condition. Sometimes people don't die when expected. This is considered inconvenient. Guests have already wept and promised to remember you fondly. Meals have been planned. The priest has other dying people to visit. But you, stubbornly, continue breathing. Perhaps you're recovering. Perhaps it's a false alarm. Or perhaps you've entered the bonus round of medieval illness, surviving just long enough to become a local legend. Didn't you die 2 days ago? Someone might ask, confused. Almost, you reply, sipping weak broth. The truth is, dying in this time wasn't glamorous, efficient, or especially quiet. It was a slow, procedural affair marked by ritual, rumour, and mild confusion. There were no medical monitors, no privacy curtains, and absolutely no hospice playlist. Only the quiet rustle of robes, the soft clink of candle holders, and the distant sound of someone sneezing in the hallway. And when the moment finally came, if it did, it passed without fanfare. A final breath, a quiet sigh, a half-hearted psalm, and then, if all went well, a decent burial. If all went poorly, well, let's just say the neighbours got creative, which, as one might imagine, brings us softly and slowly to the people tasked with handling what came next. The professional mourners, the gravediggers, and the unfortunate souls who had to figure out what to do with your shoes. Picture a city, a hot, walled, stone-baked city, Uruk. The walls, massive, decorative, not especially necessary for defence, because most of the danger was already inside them. And that danger's name? Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, builder of things, kicker of shins, part deity, part drama club lead, part walking crisis of cosmic entitlement. He was, to put it delicately, the kind of person who would name an entire city after his vibes. Now, to be fair, Gilgamesh wasn't all bad. He was tall, strong, and heavily moisturized by divine birthright. The kind of man whose resume starts with conquered death itself and ends with invented the concept of overthinking. But in his early days, he mostly just invented reasons to bother everyone around him. 2/3 God, 1/3 human, zero patience for anyone who suggested he behave like either. Gilgamesh had many interests, wrestling celestial beasts, shouting at the sky, redecorating the city walls every 6 weeks, and apparently exhausting every single citizen under his rule. He ruled like a man who had skimmed a job description and decided it sounded too much like a group project. Instead of governing, he would conduct athletic displays, poetic monologues, and casual abuses of power that made local shepherds wince into their figs. Gilgamesh did not leave a son to his father. Day and night he rampaged, which is a poetic way of saying, if Gilgamesh had a LinkedIn profile, under job responsibilities, it would just say, made everyone tired. No one slept. While Gilgamesh was king, citizens of Uruk spent a lot of time doing 3 things: praying to the gods for relief, avoiding eye contact with their king, trying to invent democracy from scratch. It didn't help that Gilgamesh had very little sense of boundaries. If there were a wedding, he'd show up and make it his own. If there were a public bath, he'd declare it a battlefield. If you were trying to have a private moment with your goat, he'd probably interrupt to discuss his latest dream about the sky turning into feathers and lecturing him about fate. The people, understandably, filed a complaint to the gods, which was bold, but when your monarch has been doing push-ups on the roof at 3 a.m. again while reciting dramatic oaths, you get desperate. So the gods, who, it must be said, were very into customer service back then, decided something had to be done, but not punishment. No, that would be rude. Instead, they opted for the most ancient, most divine conflict resolution strategy of all time. Let's make him a friend. This is not a love story, but it's kind of a bromance. The gods decided Gilgamesh didn't need therapy. He needed Enkidu, and so they crafted a companion for him out of clay, hair, and what we can only assume was a surplus of wilderness energy. But before we meet Enkidu, let's linger a little longer in the existential spa that was Uruk under Gilgamesh's early reign, because despite the nightmare's noise and erratic ruling style, Gilgamesh was loved. Not in the warm way, not bring him cookies loved. More like, please don't smite me, loved. The kind of admiration you give someone who could bench press a ziggurat. He was in some ways the prototype of every mythic hero that came after him. He was strong. He was restless. He was full of questions he tried to answer by hitting things. And, this is important, he was starting to get bored. Which, in Uruk, meant trouble. Because a bored demigod king is never good news for the public, so the gods moved their pieces, quietly. Somewhere, far from Uruk, wild things stirred in the open plains, hairy, barefoot, and destined to become the greatest friend Gilgamesh would ever have. But for now, in Uruk, the king paced the walls he built himself. He dreamed strange dreams of falling stars and heavenly axes. He threw stones into the Euphrates and wondered why they didn't answer back. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice he hadn't heard yet, Enkidu's voice, was getting ready to argue with him. Because this isn't just a story about gods or monsters. It's about two people trying very hard to understand what it means to be human. And Gilgamesh? He's about to find out that immortality has very little to do with how long you live, and everything to do with who you meet before you die. Before he was a legend, before he was a sidekick, a soulmate, or a co-defendant in multiple counts of divine vandalism, Enkidu was a mystery, and not a charming, riddle wrapped in an enigma kind. More like, why is there a very hairy man rolling in the dirt with the gazelles again, and should we be worried? He had no name at first, no address, no opinions about taxes, bread pricing, or ziggurat architecture. Just hair, lots of it. Hair in places you didn't know needed hair. He was what you get when the gods tried to build a human from memory, using mostly animal references, and a vague recollection that sleep is important, and sleep he did, curled beside wolves, draped across mossy rocks. He napped like it was a religion, a hobby, and a competitive sport. But to understand Enkidu, you have to forget civilization entirely. Out in the wild, Enkidu was king, a very unbothered, extremely unclothed king. He didn't farm, didn't write poetry, didn't shout at the heavens for attention like some people we know. No walls, no shoes, no Wi-Fi, just the wind, the grass, the occasional lion challenge, and the eternal pursuit of sleeping somewhere a beetle hadn't already claimed. He drank from rivers, he ate grass, he sang with the jackals, occasionally out of tune. But even the gods couldn't ignore that this man was a walking contradiction, full of life, full of strength, and yet deeply uninterested in doing literally anything about it. When the citizens of Uruk begged the gods to please send help, the gods interpreted that not as maybe replace Gilgamesh with someone stable, but as let's give him an equal. And so, in a rare collaborative brainstorm that probably involved a lot of wine and vague hand gestures, they decided, we'll send him, a wild man, a creature of instinct, a rustic beefcake with emotions, something between a hug and a slap. They made Enkidu from Earth, not the clean, pre-sterilized ceremonial kind, just raw dirt and the vague memory of muscle definition. And they didn't give him language, or social awareness, or pants, because nothing says divine diplomacy like hurling a feral nudist at your problems. And so he was born, fully adult, fully confused, fully uninterested in your kingdom's civic planning committee. Now this next part may read like a fever dream, but that's just ancient Mesopotamian narrative structure. Enkidu's early days consisted of running with antelope herds, lifting rocks for no reason, and very aggressively not understanding metaphors. He was the local cryptid, a legend in the fields. Children whispered about him. Shepherds blamed him for things like misplaced cheese and suspiciously startled goats. He would break hunters' traps, not out of malice, but because he liked the sound they made when they snapped. He would scare off predators with nothing but a deep growl and the kind of eye contact that says, "I once wrestled a cedar tree. I didn't win, but I made it respect me." But while Enkidu was happily exfoliating with twigs and howling at stars, the gods were already setting the next phase into motion, a phase that involved seduction, soap, and possibly a comb. A hunter, tired of Enkidu ruining his weekly productivity, went to Gilgamesh, which is never a good idea, but he was desperate. He said, "There's a wild man ruining my traps." Gilgamesh, bored and flexing in a mirror probably, said, "Send a woman," because that's how problems were solved back then, with questionable logic and poorly defined moral boundaries. So they sent Shamhat. She was a priestess of Ishtar, trained in the sacred arts of making absolutely anyone rethink their life choices. Her mission? Civilize him, tame him. Teach him that there's more to life than howling at passing squirrels. So she did. She found him. She sat with him. She smiled in ways that suggested enlightenment and also extremely confident charisma. And Enkidu, poor thing, had no defences, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she talked to him. Imagine the moment you hear language for the first time, not as noise, but as meaning. Shamhat's words were strange and lovely, like music made of weather. And Enkidu, for the first time, didn't grunt. He listened. Then she gave him bread. Actual bread. Not bark, not leaves, not the weird moss he'd been chewing on that makes your ears ring. Just bread and beer, which made him lie down, reconsider everything, and fall asleep mid-sentence. Which, to be fair, is a perfectly valid first experience with beer. When he woke up, something had changed. He looked at the grass and didn't feel like running. He looked at the animals and felt strangely self-conscious. He looked at his reflection and thought, "Oh no, I'm becoming reflective." Shamhat took him to a shepherd's camp. They shaved him, they bathed him, they put clothes on him, soft ones, not made of bark or wildly misused animal parts. And Enkidu, newly scrubbed and only a little traumatized by soap, looked around. He saw how humans lived, and he wept. Not because he was sad, but because for the first time he was aware. He knew the names of things. He could count, he could speak, he could wonder, and somewhere in the background, destiny perked up like a nosy neighbour who just saw a plot point forming, because now that Enkidu could think, speak, and make morally questionable decisions, the gods were ready to use him. His first assignment? Meet Gilgamesh, fight him, maybe kill him, maybe become his best friend, maybe invent the foundational dynamics of all future literary bromances. But for now, Enkidu was just tired, full, bathed, and overwhelmed by bread, and that, frankly, was enough. There are fights that begin with honour. There are fights that begin with rage. And then there are fights that begin because two men locked eyes and instantly recognised, yes, that is the person I need to body slam through the nearest ceremonial archway. When Enkidu entered Uruk, shaved, scrubbed, and only moderately haunted by his first encounter with soap, he didn't exactly blend in. His beard had been trimmed, but still looked like it could trap small birds. His new clothes were trying their best to stay on his shoulders, but fashion was not something wilderness men adopted gracefully. And his face, somewhere between toddler meeting civilization for the first time and Greek god learning what sarcasm is, was turning heads. And yet he walked like the ground should apologize for being beneath him. Meanwhile, Gilgamesh was being Gilgamesh. Now Gilgamesh, you'll remember, was the king of everything, including attention. He ruled Uruk with the benevolence of a toddler in charge of a toy store, possessive, dramatic, and absolutely allergic to being questioned. His hobbies included exhausting his citizens, ignoring their prayers, and physically wrestling with concepts like humility. His crown, always slightly tilted, like he wore it just to remind everyone he could. His tunic, gold-threaded, impractical, and often mysteriously open at the chest. His public appearances usually involved unsolicited poetry and at least one flexed muscle group. So when the rumours began about a new man in the city, someone strong, someone untamed, someone who might just be equal, Gilgamesh did not take it well. He stared into his bronze mirror, which he claimed was for military inspection, and whispered, "No." Now, here's where things escalate. In Uruk, it was customary for Gilgamesh to, how shall we say, attend weddings. Not as a guest, but as a participant, right before the groom. It was a tradition he invented, and one that involved exactly zero democratic input. But tonight was different, because Enkidu had heard about this royal custom, and despite his recent bath and bread-induced enlightenment, he still retained the wild man's core moral code, which could be roughly translated as, nope. So when Gilgamesh showed up, cloak billowing, smirk preloaded, utterly convinced he was about to make yet another newlywed evening weird, he found someone blocking the door, someone broad, someone quiet, someone who was, frankly, over it. Enkidu didn't speak. He just stood there, which, if you've ever tried to stop an ancient demigod king from crashing a wedding, is a pretty bold opening move. Gilgamesh, very calm and very dramatic, narrowed his eyes and said, "Who are you?" Enkidu blinked. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering whether this was a real question or just the opening line to a very disappointing poem. Then he said, "You're not going in." And that's when things got poetic. They fought. Of course they did. But not like warriors, not like gladiators, not even like angry toddlers in a sandbox. They fought like two myths having an existential crisis. Fists met flesh, shoulders collided with pride. Dust rose from the cobbled streets in moody, interpretive swirls. Citizens gathered in terrified awe, unsure if they were watching history, theatre, or the universe splitting into two slightly narcissistic versions of itself. The walls of Uruk shook, windows shattered. One very unlucky goat was emotionally scarred for life. Gilgamesh swung with the confidence of a man who'd never lost a fight. Enkidu blocked with the calm of someone who didn't even fully understand what losing meant yet. They brawled through plazas, toppled market stalls, spilled lentils that would later be written about in sad, overpriced scrolls titled "The Day the Pulses Fell." The longer the fight lasted, the more ridiculous it became. Not because of the violence, but because of the realization dawning on both of them. They were evenly matched. Gilgamesh threw Enkidu into a well. Enkidu climbed out, mildly annoyed. Enkidu knocked Gilgamesh into a wall. Gilgamesh apologized to the wall, then punched it for good measure. At one point they paused, not from exhaustion, but from confusion. Gilgamesh: "Why aren't you submitting?" Enkidu: "I thought you'd be taller." Gilgamesh: "I am taller." Enkidu: "In your sandals, maybe." There it was. Not hatred, not envy, but recognition. This wasn't just a fight. This was the ancient Mesopotamian version of swiping right. They clashed one final time, shoulder to shoulder, breath to breath, and then stopped. Not because they were tired, but because they were impressed. In the silence that followed, Gilgamesh did something no one expected. He laughed, and Enkidu, ever the quick study, grinned. Two sweaty, dirt-smudged, wildly overpowered men just standing in the aftermath of their mutual refusal to back down, and instead of continuing the chaos, they chose something more dangerous. Friendship. Yes, the ancient, awkward kind. The one built on mutual grunts, occasional wrestling, and long walks that end with one of you stealing cedar trees. Together, they would challenge gods, slay monsters, upset cosmic balances. But for now, they just stood in the ruins of a wedding procession, panting heavily and accidentally inventing the rival-turned-bestie genre. And somewhere far above, the gods sighed. Because clearly, this wasn't going to end quietly. Once the brawl-induced bromance between Gilgamesh and Enkidu had cemented itself into ancient legend, the natural next step wasn't rest or hobbies or emotional growth. It was a wildly unnecessary quest. Not for treasure, not even for love, but for a really large, extremely guarded tree. Gilgamesh, fueled by a boredom unique to immortal adjacent royalty, turned his attention toward the cedar forest. It was a sacred place, and therefore, in his eyes, just begging to be trampled through with loud sandals and legendary overconfidence. The cedar forest wasn't just a bunch of trees. It was an ecosystem powered by divine irritation. Towering trunks stretched high into the sky like judgmental elders. The branches whispered in tones that sounded suspiciously like ancient disapproval. The moss on the bark seemed to clutch at secrets older than language, while the air hovered with a damp, condescending stillness. Everything in the forest looked like it had been alive for longer than most civilizations, and deeply resented the intrusion of anyone born after the invention of bronze. No one was supposed to be there, which of course made it the perfect place for Gilgamesh and Enkidu to go. Enkidu, formerly of the wilderness and currently in a long-term relationship with perpetual confusion, knew the forest. He had heard the rustle of its branches in his dreams and the weight of its warnings in his bones. But Gilgamesh, armed with destiny, delusions, and the absolute inability to read a room, marched forward, convinced that the best way to earn immortality was by bothering someone who didn't want to be bothered. The forest, to its credit, tried to resist. Trees leaned in a little closer than necessary. The birds, ancient and sun-bleached, fell silent with the sort of stillness that suggested they'd seen this story before and didn't expect it to end well. Even the earth felt thicker underfoot, as if trying to hold them back with the inertia of ancient warning. And then there was Humbaba, technically a guardian, but spiritually more of a mythological project manager. Humbaba had spent thousands of years keeping everything in order. His job, which he never applied for, involved patrolling a forest he didn't plant, protecting a holiness he didn't entirely understand, and frightening off anyone who mistook sacred land for a photo opportunity. Descriptions of him varied, intestine-faced, fire-breathing, and chronically over it. Humbaba didn't rule the forest so much as he maintained it, begrudgingly. A creature born of divine bureaucracy, he existed somewhere between a curse and a compliance officer. When Gilgamesh and Enkidu arrived, Humbaba didn't charge. He loomed. He radiated the energy of someone who had already written a stern letter to HR and was now waiting for the moment he could submit it. What followed wasn't so much a battle as it was an emotionally overcharged disruption of sacred forestry. Gilgamesh, all ego and muscle, advanced with the confidence of a man who thought fighting monsters would impress people who don't exist yet. Enkidu, strong, skeptical, increasingly tired of myth-making, followed out of loyalty or inertia, or simply because returning to Uruk meant answering too many questions. The battle unspooled across tree roots and through clouds of unsettled birds. It wasn't elegant. There were slips and grunts, and one very undignified collision with a ceremonial log that absolutely didn't need to be there. The cedar forest, indignant, absorbed the chaos in sullen silence. Trees splintered. Dust rose. Echoes bounced off trunks like ancient gossip. In the end, Humbaba fell. Not with cinematic drama, but with the resignation of someone who's been interrupting trespassers since the dawn of civilization, and has finally run out of reasons to care. With the Guardian defeated, Gilgamesh decided to commemorate the moment by chopping down one of the oldest trees. Because nothing says reverence like immediate deforestation. The forest, having already given up emotionally, didn't protest. But everything about it, its shadowed paths, its bruised silence, its leaning canopy, seemed to sag under the weight of what had just occurred. This wasn't just a victory, it was a disturbance, a shift, the kind of act that gets scribbled into divine ledgers and filed under reckless. The gods, even the quieter ones, were now watching. And as the two heroes began their return, one emboldened and the other slightly more aware of the cost of friendship, the forest closed behind them. Slowly, grudgingly, like an ancient door being locked from the inside. The lesson, though unspoken, hung in the air like cedar smoke. Glory is heavy, and sometimes it smells like something you weren't meant to touch. Fresh off their unlicensed forestry adventure, Gilgamesh and Enkidu returned to Uruk with a trophy log, some light trauma, and the kind of swagger that only comes from defeating a sacred guardian without reading the fine print of divine consequences. Uruk, for its part, welcomed them back like most cities welcome their hyper-confident rulers, with obligatory cheering, quiet dread, and several people wondering how much the repair costs would be this time. The king paraded through the gates with the sun gleaming off his muscles and the vague scent of charred cedar still clinging to his cloak. Enkidu, ever the reluctant sidekick, followed behind, equal parts loyal companion and designated warrior. And then came the goddess. Now, Ishtar was not just any deity, she was a capital G goddess, a celestial multitasker in charge of love, war, beauty, storms of emotion, and very poor reactions to rejection. She had temples, worshippers, doves, and a flair for drama that made reality television look understated. So when she saw Gilgamesh, shining with post-quest energy, gleaming with the sweat of conquest, and utterly unaware of divine boundaries, she decided this was a man worth pursuing, or collecting. It was sometimes hard to tell with gods. She didn't whisper or hint. This was not a coy crush. Ishtar did what any respectable goddess in the Bronze Age would do. She floated down, adorned in celestial glamour, and presented her case. If the stars could blush, they would have. She was undeniably radiant. Gilgamesh, however, was not impressed. This, to be clear, was not a wise decision. Saying no to the goddess of love and war was like sending a strongly worded letter to a volcano and expecting it to calmly reconsider its lava distribution. But Gilgamesh, operating at the rare intersection of arrogance and mythic confidence, refused. He didn't just decline. He delivered a scathing monologue that catalogued every unfortunate outcome associated with Ishtar's previous lovers. It was, essentially, an ancient PowerPoint of why dating her was a historical mistake. The shepherd turned into a wolf. The gardener transformed into a broken bird. Even a lion, an actual lion, had a bad time of it. Gilgamesh ended his speech with the sort of rhetorical flourish usually reserved for courtroom dramas and ill-advised Reddit threads. The city of Uruk blinked in collective disbelief. Enkidu stared at the sky like a man already bracing for celestial consequences. Ishtar, meanwhile, ascended back into the heavens, her dignity dented and her vengeful creativity immediately activated. What followed was not subtle. The gods, when they're feeling peevish, don't just send you bad weather or awkward public embarrassment. They craft cosmic chaos with flair. Ishtar approached her father, Anu, and made a dramatic case for punishment. He hesitated. She insisted. He sighed the deep sigh of a parent who knows this is going to end poorly, and handed her what can only be described as a divine nuclear option, the Bull of Heaven. This was not a poetic name. It was exactly what it sounded like. A supernatural, famine-causing celestial bull with the personality of a tantrum and the diet of a natural disaster. The bull of heaven descended, the earth split, crops wilted, rivers ran backward or possibly sideways. It was hard to tell in the panic. People fled, walls cracked. The bull rampaged with the dispassionate fury of a divine intern who didn't want to be assigned this project, but was going to finish it anyway. Uruk reeled, screams echoed through the streets. Chickpeas were abandoned mid-boil. Even the pigeons, seasoned veterans of urban chaos, relocated. But this was Gilgamesh's city, and if there was one thing he enjoyed more than building large walls and offending deities, it was fighting creatures that should not exist. Enkidu joined him, because by now, resisting the plot was pointless. They confronted the bull. It wasn't elegant. There were slips in the dust, close calls, and more than one moment where Enkidu looked skyward in the universal gesture of, "I told you this would happen." But together, somehow, they subdued the creature. It was a miracle of timing, brute strength, and questionable decision-making. The bull of heaven lay still. And then, Gilgamesh made the worst possible decision in a city still trembling from divine fallout. He threw a piece of the bull at Ishtar. Not metaphorically, not with nuance. He physically hurled a part of the sacred animal's anatomy in her general direction and strutted off like this was a reasonable reaction to divine assault. The silence that followed was profound. The gods, up in their celestial lounge, looked at each other with the shared realization that something needed to be done. Not immediately, gods don't rush, but soon, quietly, irrevocably. Something shifted in the heavens. Something final, something cold. Enkidu, still panting, still catching his breath, glanced at Gilgamesh with the faintest expression of dread, the kind that says, "Enjoy this moment because the universe has already ordered the bill." They had won. But not really. Not in the long term, because when gods are embarrassed, they don't forget, and they never settle the score with just one person. After the bull was defeated and its remains casually repurposed for theatrical insult, the city of Uruk settled into an uneasy calm, the kind where people keep glancing at the sky like it might issue an invoice. Gilgamesh wandered the streets with his usual air of divinely ordained smugness, greeting citizens with a vague nod that said, "Yes, I did just manhandle a supernatural ox, you're welcome," while Enkidu followed in tow, beginning to suspect that their victory had come at a cost still pending in the celestial queue. And then the dreams started. Not just any dreams. These weren't the whimsical variety where you're inexplicably late for ancient algebra class or forget how doors work. No, these were the weighty, message-laden dreams you only get when the universe has decided it's time to schedule your exit. Enkidu would awaken in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat and vaguely furious, as if his soul had just been informed of its expiration date. The dreams were full of doors that didn't open, skies that frowned, and a strange house where dust was the furniture and silence was loud. And every time he woke up, the feeling got heavier. It wasn't dread, it was certainty. And certainty is never cozy. At first, Gilgamesh brushed it off with the breezy denial of a man who had never experienced consequences. After all, they had conquered everything so far. Monsters, gods, bad architecture. If fate wanted a piece of them, it would have to wait in line. But fate doesn't queue. It arrives like a bored cat, sudden, unwelcome, and supremely uninterested in your opinion. Enkidu grew weaker, not dramatically at first. It began with fatigue, then fever, then a restlessness in his limbs, like his body was trying to prepare itself for an exit it didn't understand. The man who once ran with gazelles and shouted at forests now couldn't rise from his bed without help. His wildness, his freedom, had been domesticated by a divine expiration stamp. He cursed. Not in anger, but in baffled betrayal. He cursed the gods, the forest, the bull, the gates of the netherworld, and yes, even the day he met Gilgamesh. Not because of their friendship, but because that friendship had made him visible to the divine ledger. Before, he was wild, unclaimed, free from the gods' narrative machinery. But when he became known, when he became named, he became accountable. And the gods had excellent memory. Gilgamesh watched this unfold with growing confusion. He had always seen death from a distance, a thing that happened to lesser people, peasants, enemies, anyone not reinforced by demigod status and favourable edits in mythic scrolls. But Enkidu, his brother-in-arms, his echo, his equal, was fading like parchment in rain. The king tried everything. He offered sacrifices, he lit incense, he consulted priests, astronomers, passing goats, anyone who might know how to cancel a divine mandate. But nothing helped. The illness ignored herbs and chants alike. It moved with the finality of a clock that only ticks once. In his final days, Enkidu lay still, not peaceful, resigned, like a wild creature who had finally stopped trying to escape the net. He did not pass with fanfare or celestial music. No gods descended to comfort him, no doves flitted. He simply left. The space he occupied, once so loud and alive, grew quiet in a way Gilgamesh couldn't stand, and the king, who had faced gods and monsters without flinching, sat beside the body, still and silent, learning the one thing power never teaches: helplessness. The city of Uruk mourned. But mourning for a wild man is complicated. There are no standard rituals for those who were once beasts, then brothers, then myths. Gilgamesh constructed a monument naturally. It was tall, dramatic, unnecessary, like everything else he built. But it wasn't enough. Because grief doesn't stay in stones. It lives in questions, in the aching echo of a laugh you won't hear again, in the dreams that still come, long after the fever has passed. And something broke in Gilgamesh, not loudly, but fundamentally. Until now, he had thought himself above it all. That kingship meant immortality by default, that power and poems would outlast everything. But now, confronted with a lifeless friend and a world still spinning without him, he realized the most terrifying truth. One day, even he would be forgotten. No walls would be tall enough, no temple wide enough, no epic long enough. And so began the unraveling, not of power, of certainty. Because once you realize you too will return to dust, well, you start walking and you don't stop. There's something particularly fragile about a man who has built his identity on permanence, only to discover the world is terminal by design. So Gilgamesh, freshly grief-stricken and abruptly mortal curious, did what any sleep-deprived, emotionally collapsed, semi-divine ruler might do. He set off to find a man who was allegedly immortal, lived at the edge of the world, and survived a flood so epic it once required celestial management. Why? Because if death was now a personal inconvenience, surely someone must have found the back door to the whole affair. This was the new Gilgamesh, not the brash, city-strolling demigod with a superiority complex in every footstep. This version had wild eyes, travel-worn robes, and the demeanour of someone who had tried journaling and found it ineffective. He walked not like a king, but like a question in search of a verb. The journey, naturally, was not on any map, mostly because Mesopotamian cartographers hadn't figured out how to draw beyond the known world in a satisfying way. There were no GPS coordinates, just cryptic clues passed down from temple scribes and the vague direction of that way until everything starts feeling uncanny. The road was long, and by road we mean succession of existential metaphors disguised as terrain. First came the mountains, ancient, impassable, and inconveniently symbolic. Their peaks scratched the sky like bad omens, and their shadows looked suspiciously like regret. Gilgamesh climbed anyway. Not out of confidence, just out of momentum. Because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering. Then the darkness. Not poetic darkness. Literal darkness. A tunnel so long and lightless that it took 12 nights to pass through, during which time Gilgamesh was forced to confront all the thoughts he'd been avoiding. The weight of Enkidu's absence, the silence of his palace without echo, the possibility that everything ends, badly, quietly, and far too soon. There was no villain here, no monster to punch, just his own breathing and the slow shuffle of a man who once thought he was timeless. When he emerged, the sun hurt, but so did the realization that he still didn't know what he was looking for. Eventually, after crossing rivers that had forgotten their names and plains where birds refused to sing because even the wildlife sensed this was a grief trip, he found himself in the company of Siduri. Siduri was a tavern keeper who had clearly seen many things and found them all equally disappointing. She offered wine, she offered advice. She suggested, quite reasonably, that Gilgamesh go home, plant a garden, and perhaps sit quietly with his feelings instead of chasing myths across creation. He ignored her, because of course he did. Next came the ferryman, Urshanabi. He had a name and a boat, and the weary sarcasm of someone constantly roped into immortal side quests. Gilgamesh convinced him, through a combination of pleading, dramatics, and sheer stubbornness, to ferry him across the waters of death, which are exactly what they sound like, a vast, terrifying metaphor that also happens to be a river. It required poles, dozens of them, each one used once, tossed aside, never reused. A subtle reminder, perhaps, that some things can't be reversed, and that progress, when made out of desperation, often leaves wreckage in its wake. And finally, at the edge of the known world, past the last of the metaphors and somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary gods, he found Utnapishtim. Now, Utnapishtim wasn't what Gilgamesh expected. He wasn't glowing, he didn't hover, he didn't wear a crown forged from lightning bolts. He just existed, quietly, like a man who had seen everything and, in response, decided to sit down. Immortality, it turned out, looked a lot like retirement. Gilgamesh asked his questions, the big ones. The why am I here? How do I escape death? Is there an afterlife? Does eternity have Wi-Fi variety? And Utnapishtim, being both ancient and slightly bored, answered. He told a story, a flood, a godly decision to end the world, a boat hastily built, birds sent to test the water, a deal struck, a life extended, not because of virtue but because of timing and bureaucracy. There was no grand secret, no fountain, just circumstance. Utnapishtim hadn't earned immortality, he had inherited it, and he wasn't even enjoying it. This did not sit well with Gilgamesh, because what's the point of seeking if there's no reward? Utnapishtim, perhaps out of pity or exasperation, offered him a challenge, a small test. Stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights and he'd get his answer. Immortality maybe, wisdom certainly. Gilgamesh failed, immediately. He fell asleep like a toddler after a sugar crash, deep, undeniable sleep. And when he awoke, time had passed. Loaves of bread, baked 1 per day, sat beside him, proof of his unconsciousness, proof of his humanness. And so, empty-handed, Gilgamesh received one last pity gift, knowledge of a plant, hidden in the deep, that could restore youth. It was a fragile hope, a consolation prize, and he clutched it like a starving man clutches rumours. He did find it. He pulled it from the depths, victorious once more. Then he bathed. And while he bathed, a snake ate the plant. Of course it did, because mythology loves irony. Gilgamesh didn't rage. Not this time. He didn't weep or scream or curse the gods. He simply stood still, like a man who had walked across the world to learn what could not be learned. And then he turned back, toward Uruk, toward walls he had built, toward a city he once ruled like a god, and now might rule like a man. Because sometimes the lesson isn't in the answer, it's in the walking. After all the tunnels, deserts, metaphor-laced rivers, and extremely unhelpful immortals, Gilgamesh returned to Uruk the same way many travelers do after a long, life-altering voyage, utterly exhausted, questionably hygienic, and unsure what to do with his hands. He'd left the city as a king who could not be questioned. He returned as a man who had questioned everything. Uruk hadn't crumbled in his absence. Not dramatically, anyway. The walls were still there, those vast, sun-baked ramparts he once saw as monuments to his greatness. But they looked different now, less like proof of permanence, more like a complicated legacy he'd accidentally left behind, and now had to emotionally reconcile with. The city welcomed him with that particular brand of ancient Mesopotamian ambivalence reserved for rulers who disappear for months without a forwarding address. There were no parades, no heralds proclaiming the return of the semi-divine hero king. Mostly, there were market stalls that still needed restocking, irrigation systems that still didn't work properly, and temple priests who had questions about taxes. People nodded, politely, like, "Oh, you're back. We were almost done replacing you with a council." But Gilgamesh didn't mind, because something inside him had shifted. Not broken exactly, more like reassembled incorrectly, but in a way that made more sense. He walked the streets of Uruk with quieter feet, not because he'd lost strength, but because he'd stopped confusing noise with purpose. His once thundering stride had softened into something less cinematic and more considerate. He still towered above most mortals, but no longer seemed surprised or offended by their existence. He visited the palace. It was dusty and enormous, and filled with things he used to think mattered. A trophy here, a gold-plated weapon there. He looked at it all like a man revisiting the home of a past self and wondering why they owned so many expensive but impractical chairs. The throne still fit him, but barely. Mostly in the way that old shoes technically still fit, but make you question your entire life when you wear them too long. Instead of ruling with declarations and wrestling matches, Gilgamesh began speaking with scribes. He asked them to write, not about his triumphs, but about everything. The good, the bad, the wildly confusing. He wanted the city to remember, even if it didn't make sense, especially if it didn't make sense. The epic began to take shape, a story not just of one man's strength, but of his grief, his longing, his cosmic confusion, and the terribly inconvenient discovery that immortality is both impossible and also kind of overrated. He spoke about Enkidu, not as a sidekick or wild man or plot device, but as the only person who had ever met him at eye level and dared to say no. He described the cedar forest, the monsters they fought, the gods they offended, the dreams that still haunted his sleep. He asked the scribes to include the part where he failed, where he slept, where the snake won, where the bread went stale, where he stared at the plant that was supposed to make him young again and thought, maybe I don't want to do this forever. And he had them right about Uruk, not just its walls, which he had once loved like a mirror, but its people, its messiness, its constant state of mild disrepair and surprising resilience, its way of continuing on even when legends wandered off and forgot to pay the sanitation workers. Gilgamesh no longer sought to be remembered for outliving death. He wanted to be remembered for witnessing life, all of it, even the unpleasant bits, especially those. He spent his remaining years not conquering, but observing, occasionally sighing, occasionally laughing, often sitting in places where no one recognized him, watching children squabble over flatbread and potters yell at donkeys that refused to behave. The city pulsed around him, not because of him, but in spite of him, and that, strangely, brought peace. He aged, slowly but unmistakably. His hands bore the creases of choices. His face told the story of loss. And when he finally died, because yes, even kings die, Uruk mourned him not as a god who ruled with muscle and myth, but as a man who dared to wonder what any of it meant. They say his tomb was built beneath the river, lined with jewels and curses and secrets nobody ever found, which is classic Gilgamesh. Dramatic, unnecessary, slightly confusing, and strangely touching. And so ends the story of the man who went looking for forever and came back with something quieter, something better, a name written in clay, a city still standing, a friend remembered, and a story told again. It always begins with a horse. Not a metaphorical horse, not a heraldic horse stitched into a noble family's banner, but a very literal, very dusty horse whose hooves have not known rest since the edge of Asia. This horse, unbothered by fame or geopolitics, carries a rider with the unsettling charisma of a man who has just decided that your empire belongs in his saddlebag. The horse, tired and presumably regretting its life choices, is named nothing that history bothered to record, but the man on its back, Attila, not yet the scourge of God. At this point, he's more of a mild concern of the Danube, or perhaps slightly worrying cousin from the east. But he's getting there. Attila arrives not with a trumpet blast or a scroll of lineage, but with the quiet menace of a gathering thundercloud, one that doesn't bring rain, just chaos and possibly some very uncomfortable treaties. He's a man with no interest in Roman civility, no fondness for wine watered down into disappointment, and absolutely no plans to sit quietly at the barbarian kid's table. Let's set the scene. The year is somewhere in the 430s. Western civilization is, shall we say, not at its peak. The Roman Empire is essentially a very tired bureaucrat held together with twine and unpaid soldiers. The Eastern Roman Empire is slightly less exhausted, but mostly due to outsourcing its anxiety to Constantinople's astrologers and minor saints. Into this mix of crumbling marble and diplomatic whimpering rides Attila, accompanied by his brother Bleda, whose name history often forgets, possibly because he made the mistake of trusting Attila to share. The Huns, you see, weren't your standard horse-loving, arrow-slinging nomads. Well, actually, they were exactly that, but better at it, faster at it, and significantly more likely to show up uninvited at your city gates demanding tribute, which is warlord for "give us gold, or we redecorate your walls with flaming javelins." Attila himself wasn't born in a palace. There was no silver spoon, unless he'd stolen one and used it as a tent peg. His early years are obscured by the usual historical fog that hangs over people who didn't leave behind marble statues or endless scrolls about dinner parties. What we do know is that he grew up in a culture that thought riding horses, fighting wars, and braiding your hair very tightly were essential life skills. He likely learned to shoot arrows before he learned to write his name, assuming he ever bothered with that sort of thing. The Romans, for their part, tried very hard to pretend Attila wasn't a problem. They had other issues: religious schisms, unpaid soldiers, an economy that could be best described as wobbly, and far too many emperors with far too few actual ideas. So when the Huns began showing up on the eastern borders with their terrifying composite bows and their "we don't play by your rules" attitude, the Romans did what they always did: tried diplomacy, sent bribes, and issued increasingly desperate letters signed in fading ink and fear sweat. Attila, to his credit, didn't storm the gates right away. At first, he observed. He watched the Romans squabble. He noted where the roads were weakest, which governors were most corruptible, and how many coins it took to make a border town open its gates with a shrug. He paid attention, Because if there's one thing Attila excelled at, it was identifying vulnerability, especially if it wore a toga and tried to charge him customs tax. The thing about Attila was, he didn't fit the Roman idea of a barbarian. He was intelligent, strategic, and alarmingly diplomatic when it suited him. He wasn't some wild beast charging at city walls. He was the kind of leader who made a point of knowing who you were, how much gold you had, and whether your walls could withstand a siege of highly mobile, extremely irritable horsemen. And so it began. A horse, a hill, a man with ambitions that didn't stop at the Danube. In later centuries, scholars would try to interpret Attila through lenses of Roman propaganda, religious fervour, and the sort of nostalgia that turns marauders into misunderstood geniuses. But in that moment, on that hill, in the silence before the thunder, Attila was simply a man with a purpose. A man with a brother he hadn't yet murdered. A man with a fur-lined cloak that didn't care for Roman fashion trends. And perhaps most dangerously, a man who had noticed that the empire, glorious and sprawling as it once was starting to wobble just enough to push. Attila didn't just ride into history. He cantered up to its borders, looked it over, nodded to himself, and decided it needed some structural adjustments. And now that we've met him, we're already in trouble. It is a truth universally acknowledged that any man who conquers half a continent will, at some point, need to discuss inheritance, preferably without swords being drawn. But this is the Hunnic Empire, and no one here has ever gently passed down a crown with a ceremonial handshake. The Hun version of estate planning is less who gets the keys to the estate, and more who survives breakfast. Older brother to Attila, co-ruler of the Huns, and, at first glance, a perfectly competent warlord. History has not been especially generous to Bleda, probably because Attila, like all people destined for bloody fame, had a way of hogging the narrative spotlight. But Bleda was no pushover. He shared command of the empire, negotiated with Rome, and likely had the same terrifying horseback archery skills that made the Huns the medieval equivalent of mobile artillery. Still, if you've ever had to share a project with an overachieving sibling, you already know how this ends. To the outside world, Bleda and Attila presented a united front. The Hunnic Empire, a federation of fiercely independent tribal groups bound together by blood, gold, and mutually assured destruction, accepted them as twin pillars of power. The Romans, always fans of splitting the difference, tried to treat them as a matched set. Letters were sent, treaties were proposed, tribute flowed to both brothers in the hope that keeping them both paid would keep the empire intact. Internally, however, you can imagine how this went. Two brothers, both raised for leadership, both used to getting their way, both equally ambitious, and now expected to co-rule an empire founded on war, raiding, and the occasional political strangling. It's a bit like giving two wolves a steak and asking them to share. There is no diary entry from Bleda saying, "Dear Papyrus, I think Attila is plotting something." There's no intercepted note in Gothic cursive that reads, "Have you seen the way he's looking at my horse? This won't end well." But by 445, only one of them would be left ruling the Huns. And it wouldn't be Bleda. The details of his death are, unsurprisingly, fuzzy. Ancient historians were better at drama than fact-checking, and Attila didn't leave behind a PowerPoint presentation explaining the chain of events. Some accounts say Bleda died in battle, others hint at a quiet assassination. A few even suggest that Attila engineered an accident, which, in Hun terminology, might involve a bear, a cliff, or a mysteriously disappearing hunting party. What we do know is that after Bleda's death, Attila ruled alone. No joint declarations, no co-signed treaties, just one man with an empire of warriors behind him and no more need to compromise on anything. The Huns didn't object. possibly because objecting to Attila's decisions was a fast track to becoming a warning example. Now, in more refined empires, you might expect a mourning period, some ceremonial wailing, a marble plaque, at the very least a sad little toast with watered-down mead. But this was the steppe, and mourning traditions were more practical. Blaida's death meant fewer voices at the war council and fewer complications when deciding which Roman province to squeeze next. Whatever grief existed was probably expressed in a subdued moment of silence, followed by the sharpening of many weapons. With Blaida gone, Attila entered his golden age of terror. He consolidated power quickly, efficiently, and with the sort of confident menace that made Roman diplomats weep into their togas. He didn't have to ask permission anymore. He didn't have to worry about negotiating with anyone except terrified emperors and overcooked generals. And in a strange way, Attila may have mourned his brother in the only way he knew how, by becoming so successful, so fearsome, and so unforgettable that even the gods, it seemed, would take note. This, by the way, is how you become a one-name icon. Attila didn't just rule the Huns, he became the Huns. After Blaida's mysterious departure from the narrative, there was no one left to challenge him, question him, or divide tribute with him. All gold flowed to Attila, all titles belonged to Attila, all roads led to wherever Attila decided to take his horse next. And the Romans? Oh, the Romans were beginning to realize that they had gone from negotiating with two warlords to negotiating with a thunderstorm in human form. A thunderstorm with surprisingly good organizational skills and absolutely no tolerance for delay. So ends the tale of fraternal diplomacy. Blaida is remembered, if at all, as the man who wasn't Attila. A footnote in his younger brother's rise. A temporary inconvenience on the road to total domination. Whether Attila wept, chuckled, or simply shrugged at his brother's absence, we'll never know. But the empire, now unified under a single leader, was ready for its next act. By the time the 440s rolled around, Attila had refined his empire into something leaner, sharper, and far more unsettling than Rome was prepared to handle. Where earlier generations of Hunnic leaders had been content with raiding, pillaging, and occasionally trading horses for trinkets, Attila was cultivating a more sustainable and considerably more theatrical approach to dominance. Namely, showing up uninvited, saying very little, and watching gold pile itself neatly into carts. His preferred venue for these performances was the Danube River. On one side, Rome, increasingly hollowed out, staffed by administrators who spent more time filing paperwork than leading armies. On the other, Attila, who had no paperwork and didn't need any. His paperwork was the landscape behind him, occasionally smouldering. The Danube had long served as a sort of diplomatic trench between the so-called civilized world and the horse-powered reality beyond it. And yet, it was never quite enough of a barrier. The Romans had built cities, forts, and supply lines along its banks. The Huns had built an expectation. When they crossed the river, things happened. And most of those things ended in concessions. Attila, inheriting this legacy, saw the value of spectacle. Instead of launching immediate assaults, he would occasionally engage in something that resembled negotiation. Except these negotiations were never really about terms. They were about pressure. They were about watching Roman officials squint at maps while trying not to tremble. About taking the temperature of an empire through the sweat level of its ambassadors. He would arrive at these summits, surrounded not by scribes or scholars, but by riders. They weren't there to speak. They were there to exist, as living punctuation to everything Attila didn't say out loud. No weapons needed to be drawn. No threats needed to be vocalized. The threats were implied, present in the quiet clinking of armor, the 1,000-yard stairs, and the knowledge that most of the Roman Empire's defensive strategies currently lived on parchment. Rome, of course, responded in the only way it knew how, by offering to pay for its own continued survival. They had already been providing annual tribute, a kind of golden anesthesia meant to dull the edges of Hunnic aggression. Attila, always a shrewd negotiator, began to revise the terms, not with bluster, but with the sort of calm assurance that suggested he knew what the conclusion would be before the first coin was even counted. Under his leadership, the tribute increased, border terms shifted, entire settlements were quietly handed over or abandoned, not because they had been taken, but because no one had the heart, or the troops, to argue about it anymore. These were not defeats in battle. These were quiet forfeitures, the kind that happen when one side realizes that resistance costs more than surrender. Attila's genius was not just in winning wars, but in avoiding them altogether by making his intentions so clearly unpalatable that most cities simply calculated the expense of rebuilding and decided they'd rather not. He exploited the Roman reliance on protocol, turning every legal loophole and diplomatic ambiguity into a crowbar. He didn't tear down their walls. He watched them hand over the keys, hoping that the gesture would be enough. These moments on the Danube weren't anomalies. They were blueprints. Every meeting further established the pattern. Rome would blink first. Rome would pay more. Rome would issue treaties written in carefully inked Latin, which Attila might use to balance a saddlebag before continuing on to the next soft target. Through it all, Attila's greatest weapon was presence. He mastered the use of proximity, hovering near cities without attacking, remaining just outside the range of retaliation, pressing psychological buttons until someone in a robe finally gave up another chest of gold. The empty scabbard, if indeed he brought one, became a symbol, not of peace, but of supreme confidence, a statement that no sword was needed to extract wealth from the greatest empire on earth. The fear alone would suffice. It was diplomacy as chess, but with cavalry pieces that occasionally trampled the board just to prove a point. And so the Danube became more than a river. It became a stage, a theatre of imperial unravelling, where one empire pretended it was still in charge, and the other didn't need to pretend at all. This strategy, of course, was never permanent. The gold only fed the appetite. Eventually, Attila would stop asking and start taking again. But for a time, the negotiations served their purpose. They fattened his coffers, solidified his mythos, and taught Rome the valuable lesson that silence, properly executed, can be the loudest threat of all. And as the horsemen turned north once again, barely breaking stride, the empire exhaled, only to realize it had agreed to more than it remembered. By the time Attila turned his attention to Gaul, Rome was more or less holding itself together with the administrative equivalent of twine and muttered prayers. The Western Empire had grown spectacularly bad at saying no, and increasingly proficient at writing checks with provinces they couldn't defend. The East had bought some breathing room by offering Attila a fortune in tribute and enough awkward treaties to bind a small forest. But the West had land. Tempting, verdant, relatively underdefended land. And Gaul, modern-day France, had it all. Rivers, vineyards, cities that hadn't yet burned down, and a population just distant enough from Italy to make them feel expendable. That made it a perfect target for Attila's next large-scale existential crisis, except this one involved less introspection and more cavalry. This campaign wasn't just another raid, it was a statement. It was Attila announcing, in hoofbeats and siege smoke, that he had tired of pretending diplomacy was his primary language. No more border negotiations, no more subtle gestures from horseback. Now it was battering rams, scorched towns, and the kind of military momentum that inspires second thoughts in even the most stubborn bishops. Gaul, to its credit, did try to resist. Local rulers made frantic alliances, dug shallow ditches, and summoned what could generously be called armies, though much of their defence seemed to consist of hoping Attila would get bored and go home. He did not. What he did do was roll across the countryside with such speed and brutal efficiency that maps needed constant updating just to keep up with the locations that no longer existed. City after city collapsed under the pressure. Metz, Trier, Reims, and others that were once proud Roman outposts and now resembled particularly well-organised bonfires. Attila moved not like a conqueror with interest in administration, but like a force of nature with very specific gripes. He didn't linger. He didn't negotiate. He advanced, paused only to resupply, and continued. Every village that surrendered was ignored. Every town that resisted became a smoky reminder that he had somewhere to be. And where, exactly, was he going? Paris. At the time, Paris wasn't the shimmering cultural nexus it would later become. It was smaller, scrappier, and slightly more concerned with survival than aesthetics. Still, its location was strategic, and its fall would have sent a message even louder than the previous half-dozen ruined cities. The idea of Attila entering Paris is something history barely sidestepped, a chilling near miss that could have turned the city's future into something entirely unrecognizable. But then, something happened. Something Rome hadn't managed in years. Someone fought back, and it worked. Enter Flavius Aetius, one of the last Roman generals who still remembered how to win a battle, and, crucially, still had the credibility to gather allies. He cobbled together a Frankenstein coalition of Romans, Visigoths, and other regional powers who, despite deep-seated mutual dislike, agreed that a world without Paris was perhaps a step too far. What followed was the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, sometimes known as one of the last major victories of the Western Roman Empire, and sometimes remembered for its sheer volume of dust and indecision. It was less a tidy military encounter and more a chaotic collision of momentum, politics, and very tired horses. Attila, ever the tactician, had the upper hand in cavalry, but the Allied forces had the benefit of terrain, numbers, and the kind of last-ditch determination that grows when you're defending your wine country from a man who sets entire provinces on fire before lunch. The battle was brutal, it was ugly, it was inconclusive enough that both sides could claim something resembling a moral victory. Attila technically wasn't defeated. He retreated in good order, with his forces intact and his reputation more or less untouched. But he also didn't take Paris, or the rest of Gaul. And for a man who usually ended campaigns by redrawing borders, it was, at the very least, a speed bump. Paris survived, barely. It survived in part thanks to Aetius, and in part thanks to a general sense of fatigue that swept across the battlefield after a day of relentless slaughter. Even Attila, it seemed, knew when to fold, especially if folding just meant retreating long enough to plan something worse. Gaul, though devastated, was not erased, but it carried scars, literal and political, that would reshape its internal structures for decades. The cities Attila passed through never fully recovered. The ones he skipped lived in the shadow of the ones he hadn't, and the people, they told stories, whispered legends of a horseman with no patience and an empire that had no pause button. Attila didn't lose sleep. Sleep lost Attila. At least that's what it felt like to the people of the Roman Empire in the year 452, when the Scourge of God decided it was time to take a walking tour of northern Italy. Though walking implies something gentler than what actually happened, which was more akin to dragging the Alps backwards by force of will. Why Rome? Why now? Because Rome was still, symbolically at least, the centre of the world. It didn't have its old bite, Politically, it had become less the empire's brain and more its fondly remembered spleen, but it retained prestige. Prestige that made it the perfect next chapter in Attila's campaign of strategic stress testing. If you wanted to show the world you could dismantle a superpower, there was no better final act than casually threatening the most storied city in the Western world. Northern Italy, unfortunately, was in the way. Verona fell. Aquileia, once a proud city and one of the empire's fortified front doors, lasted just long enough to remind the world what a siege looked like before it ceased to be a functioning noun. Legend has it that Attila razed it so thoroughly that even the ruins gave up. Its fall sent a very clear message to the rest of Italy. Your turn is coming, and your insurance policy expired in Gaul. From there, Attila and his forces moved south, rolling through the fertile Po Valley like it was a supermarket aisle. Towns emptied ahead of him. Wealthy families retreated to their countryside villas. The poor did what they always did: hoped, fled, or braced. Rome had seen invaders before, of course. The Visigoths under Alaric had sacked the city just a few decades earlier. But Attila was something else. Alaric was a barbarian king. Attila was a concept. He had become shorthand for unstoppable catastrophe. And yet, despite the momentum, the scorched fields, and the general theme of existential dread, Attila didn't make it to Rome. Why? That's where history gets vague, speculative, and just a little theatrical. Enter Pope Leo I, also known as Leo the Great. Not because he arm-wrestled Attila, but because he showed up, possibly unarmed, definitely unbothered, and somehow managed to talk the Huns out of finishing what they'd started. There's no clear transcript of what was said, though it's safe to assume the Pope didn't open with jokes. But somehow, this single bishop convinced Attila, mid-campaign, to turn around and go home. Theories abound. Some say Attila respected the moral authority of the church. Some say Leo offered tribute and gifts more quietly than the chroniclers admit. Others speculate that Attila had already achieved his strategic objectives and didn't want to risk stretching his forces thin. A less glamorous but more plausible explanation involves famine and disease. The Hunnic army may have been running out of supplies and into plagues. Nothing ruins a good sacking like dysentery. But the result remains. Attila didn't sack Rome. He stood on the brink of it, weighed his options, and left, which, for Rome, was just about the most relief it had felt since someone invented aqueducts. It wasn't an act of mercy. Attila didn't do mercy. It was, like most of his decisions, calculated. He'd already made his point. Rome was not untouchable. He had gotten closer than anyone since the glory days of the early emperors had dared to imagine. His withdrawal was not a concession. It was a statement. I could have. I didn't. Think about that. And Rome did think about it. For years, probably while nervously eyeing every horse in the distance. Attila's journey south left Italy rattled, broken in places, and profoundly aware that the world it once ruled was slipping further and further away. Cities became smaller, fortifications became thicker, people started writing down prayers more than policies. As for Attila, he returned north, not in defeat, but in a kind of smug silence that only a man who had stared down an empire and walked away untouched could manage. His warpath ended not with a bang, but a procession. His soldiers remained undefeated, his horses unbothered, his enemies exhausted. And yet, for all his survival through countless battles, political traps, and apocalyptic omens, his final chapter would be surprisingly domestic. Because what history doesn't always tell you is that the man who nearly destroyed Rome was eventually defeated by something far less dramatic than a legion of Romans or a clever general. There's a particular irony that history likes to reserve for its loudest conquerors. After decades of thundering hooves, terrified townsfolk, scorched fields, and empires brought to their knees, Attila, commander of the Huns, menace of both East and West, the living embodiment of medieval anxiety, died in bed. Yes, bed. Not in battle, not poisoned at a banquet, not betrayed by a scheming general or stabbed by a jealous sibling, although to be fair, that one would have been on brand. But bed. Wedding bed, to be specific. By the year 453, Attila had crushed most of what was crushable, extracted enough gold from Constantinople to bankrupt a dragon, and terrified both halves of the Roman Empire into diplomatic acrobatics. So naturally he decided the time was right to get married. Again. The number of his previous wives remains uncertain because counting Hunnic marriages is like trying to alphabetize a stampede. Technically possible, but nobody survives the attempt. This latest bride was named Ildiko, a young woman of noble Germanic stock, possibly offered as part of a political alliance, or maybe just because someone somewhere thought that giving Attila a bride might distract him from rearranging the map of Europe. Spoiler, it didn't. The wedding was lavish, at least by steppe nomad standards. There was feasting, there was drinking, there was more drinking. Attila, as usual, overindulged, because moderation was for people who hadn't renamed themselves after divine punishment. He retired for the evening in high spirits, with a stomach full of meat, a head full of wine, and the sort of confidence only earned by someone who's personally made 2 emperors cry. The next morning, he didn't come out. At first, no one panicked. It was Attila, after all. Maybe he was sleeping in. Maybe the wedding had been especially tiring. Or maybe no one wanted to be the person who knocked on the door and risked getting growled at. But eventually, concern overtook fear. Someone entered the tent. What they found was equal parts anticlimactic and bizarre. Attila lay motionless. There was no wound, no sign of struggle, no dagger in the back, no poison cup tipped over on the floor. Just a nosebleed, a fatal one. It's believed, at least by some ancient chroniclers, that he had ruptured a blood vessel in his sleep, possibly due to the sheer volume of alcohol and meat consumed the night before. The blood, rather than exiting helpfully, had flooded down his throat, suffocating him quietly. The scourge of God had drowned in his own celebratory excess. It was the kind of death you wouldn't assign to your main villain if you were writing a serious historical epic. It lacked the drama, the grandeur, the final duel under a red sky. Instead, it had all the makings of a cautionary tale about heart health and portion control. Some historians have speculated about foul play. Maybe Ildiko was a spy. Maybe one of his generals, tired of being a footnote in someone else's legend, saw an opportunity. But no evidence ever surfaced, at least not the kind that doesn't come with a side of medieval conspiracy and a shaky grasp of anatomy. Most accounts simply describe it as natural causes. Well, natural for a man whose idea of a good evening involved banquet tables, battlefield maps, and a total disregard for blood pressure. The Huns mourned him with all the theatrics you'd expect. His body was laid in state. His people sliced their faces in grief so their blood might show more devotion than mere tears. Then came the funeral, lavish, secretive, and allegedly involving a triple coffin, iron, silver, and gold. According to legend, the slaves who buried him were executed to keep the grave's location secret, a fittingly grim encore for a life of thunder and conquest. And then, silence. Because without Attila, the Hunnic Empire, if you could call it that, was a bit like a campfire once someone stops throwing logs on it. Still warm, yes, but already fading. His sons tried to carve up the territory, but unity was never the Huns' strong suit. They squabbled, they failed, the subject peoples revolted, and before long, what had once been a mobile apocalypse dispersed into the footnotes of history. But the legend of Attila stuck. It always does, with figures like him. People remembered the name, the fear, the sensation of seeing dust on the horizon and wondering if today was the day your city got rebranded as a pile of ash. They didn't remember him for how he died. They remembered him for making entire empires feel like guest stars in his one-man show. Still, it's hard not to picture it. The great Attila, slayer of cities, invader of worlds, lying still under the soft glow of dawn, defeated at last not by arrows, armies, or ambition, but by an ordinary human body that simply stopped cooperating. In the end, he was mortal, excessively mortal. And perhaps that's the part that kept Rome awake at night, not just the fear of Attila returning, but the knowledge that even gods of war bleed red, snore loudly, and sometimes just don't wake up. When Attila died, the earth didn't shake, the sky didn't darken, no horses screamed across the heavens, no imperial decrees were issued declaring, "Thank goodness that's over." But somewhere, across the scorched grasslands, along the anxious edges of the Roman frontiers, and deep in the cautious hearts of nervous emperors, there was an audible sigh. Not of celebration, not yet, just cautious hope. As if the entire continent had been holding its breath and finally, tentatively, began to exhale. Because when you take the thunder out of a storm, what's left is just clouds. And the Hunnic Empire, for all its roaring fury under Attila, wasn't so much an empire in the Roman sense as it was a glorified panic attack on horseback. Held together not by bureaucracy or trade routes or marble forums, but by sheer terror and a magnetic personality with a taste for gold, threats and dramatic entrances. And that personality was now lying beneath the ground in an allegedly triple-layered coffin surrounded by the eternal silence of everyone who knew where he was buried. What came next wasn't so much a collapse as it was a dissolve, the kind of slow-motion disaster where no one starts screaming, but you can smell that something's gone off. Attila had many sons. Historians often disagree on the exact number because counting offspring in nomadic warrior cultures is a lot like herding smoke with a fork. But at least 3 are named in the aftermath: Elek, Dengizic, and Ernak. Each eager, each ambitious, and each deeply committed to the art of poor decision-making. The Hunnic succession plan turned out to be more of a group project with no leader, no rubric, and 3 students who all believed they were in charge. Each son claimed a piece of the inheritance, land, people, horses, whatever was left unguarded. The result was not order. It was something closer to a competitive scavenger hunt, only with swords. Elak, the eldest, tried to take the lead, tried to rally the Hunnic tribes under a single banner the way dear old Dad had done. But there was one small issue. He wasn't Attila. He didn't have the voice, the fear factor, or the ability to convince people to ride headlong into enemy lines based solely on a glare and a raised eyebrow. Meanwhile, the people who had lived under Attila's rule, the Ostrogoths, Gepids, and a rather grouchy assortment of Slavs, Alans, and other miscellaneous tribes, suddenly remembered that they hadn't exactly signed up for this whole Empire of Terror thing voluntarily. Now that the guy with the war face was gone, rebellion seemed like a perfectly reasonable afternoon activity. And so, in the year 454, a mere 1 year after Attila's festive demise, the Battle of Nadao happened. This was less of a noble clash between legacies and more of a chaotic unbooking of previously reserved seats in the theatre of fear. The formerly subjugated tribes joined forces and turned on the Huns like unpaid interns at a startup whose CEO just vanished. Elak led the Hunnic forces. It did not go well. He died. The army was defeated, and just like that, the facade of Hunnic unity collapsed like a yurt made of wet parchment. The brothers who remained, Dengizic and Ernak, continued to fight for scraps. They skirmished. They negotiated badly. Dengizich even tried threatening the Eastern Roman Empire again. Rome, no longer impressed, sent a general who handled the situation with less diplomacy and more decapitation. Dengizich's head was sent back to Constantinople and displayed on a pole as if to say, "Thank you for your submission, please don't write again." Ernak, the youngest, eventually settled in the Balkans and faded into relative obscurity. He may have ruled a small remnant of Hunnic peoples, but by then the Huns were less a terror of the known world and more of a niche cultural footnote. And so the Hunnic Empire ended, not with fire, not with screams, but with paperwork being quietly filed under former threats. Rome went back to bickering with itself. The Goths resumed their own brand of empire-in-waiting chaos. The steppes emptied of their thunder, the riders dispersed, and the memory of Attila hardened into legend. His life stretched into stories, his name still whispered as the boogeyman of imperial nightmares. But no one replaced him, because what he'd built wasn't meant to last. It was a monument not of stone, but of speed and smoke, a legacy made of motion. As long as Attila rode, the world reeled. But without him, the Huns were just people with horses. And horses, it turns out, can only carry you so far when no one fears your name anymore.